welcome to today's session on illicit indicators and the contested politics of numbers. My name is Alex Cooley, and it's my pleasure, along with my co-director Jack Snyder, to welcome you to the next in our Harriman Core Project series of events on human rights in the post-communist world, actors, strategies, and outcomes. And the purpose behind the series, and we've seen some of you before, is to bring academics working on human rights types of issues, and especially issues of measurement, strategies, and effectiveness into dialogue with policymakers. And this is the final one of our cluster of events here in February. We'll have some more events in April and then again in the fall, so please stay tuned for those. I am delighted to introduce today's panel, and Peter Andreas, Sally Mary, Lara Nettelfield, and Elizabeth Eagen. Let me just briefly introduce all of them, and then they'll kick off today's discussion. Peter Andreas is Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown University. His work bridges the fields of security studies and international political economy. This includes research on transnational crime and crime control, the politics of borders and smuggling, and the political economy of conflict, post-conflict reconstruction. And he's conducted field work in a great many different locales, including Latin America, the United States, and the Balkans. Andreas is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 8 books, including titles like Blue Helmets and Black Markets, The Business of Survival in the Siege of Sarajevo, Policing the Globe, Criminalization, Crime Control, and International Relations, and my personally favorite title, Sex, Drugs, and Body Counts, The Politics of Numbers in Global Crime and Conflict, Cornell University Press, 2010, co-edited with Kelly Greenhill. He is currently researching and writing a book on the politics of smuggling in American history, tentatively entitled Smuggler Nation, Illicit Trade, and the Making of America. To Peter's left, Sally Engel-Mary is Professor of Anthropology and Law and Society at New York University. Her recent books include Colonizing Hawaii, The Cultural Power of Law, Princeton University Press 2000, Human Rights and Gender Violence, Translating International Law into Local Justice, University of Chicago Press 2006, Gender Violence, A Cultural Perspective, Blackwell's 2009, and The Practice of Human Rights, Tracking Law Between the Local and Global, co-edited with Mark Goodale, Cambridge University Press 2007. She is past president of the Law and Society Association and the Association for Political and Legal Anthropology, and president-elect of the American Ethnological Society. The Law and Society Association awarded her the Hearst Prize for Colonizing Hawaii in 2002 and the Calvin Prize for overall scholarly contributions to socio-legal law scholarship in 2007, and the School of American Research awarded her the J.I. Staley Prize in 2010 for Human Rights and Gender Violence. I should also mention that Professor Mary is involved in an NYU project on indicators as a technology of global governance, and we're also pleased to welcome her colleague here, Kevin Davis, who's part of that project too. So we're really delighted to have you here today with us. Lara Nettelfield. You may have seen her here before. She is a postdoc for the year here at Harriman, author of the excellent book, Courting Democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, The Hague Tribunal's Impact in the Post-War State, and co-author with Sarah Wagner of the book, also forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, Srebrenica in the Aftermath of Genocide. She is also a contributor to the Sex, Drugs, and Body Counts volume. Delighted to have Lara here. And finally, our practitioner, and we're very happy that, I'm very happy to introduce Elizabeth Eagen, and she's come here a little bit on short notice, and so we're really grateful to you, Elizabeth, to bring your perspective, but she's really an ideal practitioner to comment on these presentations. Elizabeth is Program Officer for the Information Program, the Human Rights and Governance Grants Programs, and Human Rights Data Initiative at Open Society Foundations. With the Information Program, she focuses globally on human rights data projects, the use of new media tools and information management, developing grants and grant making for organizations, creating sets of data to answer human rights and policy questions, and support advocacy campaigns with data visualization tools and tactics. She also introduced the Human Rights Data Initiative project with the goal of giving human rights organizations in the OSI network the opportunity to think about what kind of technology tools might contribute best to their work. Elizabeth holds a BA from the University of Michigan. She has previously worked for Human Rights Watch and for OSI in Budapest. Thank you to you all. One final comment I'll make here. I've known Peter for a while, and I think, was it maybe 2 or 3 American Political Science Association meetings ago, he was telling me, well, what's your next project, Peter? And he said, oh, I'm co-editing a book on illicit indicators. And I just said, what? Okay. And then I kind of moved on to the next topic because I didn't really understand what he meant by this. Apparently I wasn't alone, because my understanding is quite a few university press editors passed up on sex, drugs, and body counts. And everyone who I've spoken to since really regret that decision. The book has sold out in 3 weeks. It's gotten rave review from Slate. It really is a provocative work that's been initiating and stimulating all sorts of debate. So Peter, hats off to you, and welcome to Columbia.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to come up there? Or here?
Whatever you like.
Okay,
Whatever you
I'll
like.
just talk from here if you guys can hear me.
Just use a mic.
You know, I was going to make a pitch for the book, but Alex already did it for me. So thank you, Alex. That was very generous. In fact, I could not, I'll just say, I could not even get my current book editor interested in this book at the time. But anyway, it worked out. I'm not responsible for the title. That's my co-editor. So I'll blame her. I had a different suggestion. I actually like it, but it's a little edgy, a little risque for academic books. Anyway, the book was inspired in some ways by 2 brilliant people. One is Albert Einstein, of course. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. That's quite a brilliant observation. And then the other brilliant person is Steve Colbert. The statistics you don't compile never lie. That was quite insightful as well. It's right up there with Einstein. All right, what we discovered in putting this project together was based on a couple conferences, one at the Kennedy School at Harvard and one at the Watson Institute at Brown, is that really there's remarkably little out there in the literature on the politics of quantification. There's actually a small and growing cottage industries of books on sort of how statistics lie and how to measure better and how not to get deceived by numbers. But actually looking at the policy implications and tracing how these numbers are created, produced, abused, and reproduced through the policy process, really it's a fairly thin literature. So this is just, you know, in some ways a first take. It's a very interdisciplinary project. We have anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, and actually a few policy practitioners involved. So more broadly speaking, it is a book about the numbers fetish in policy debates. And the 2 realms that we're most interested in this book are the realms of global crime and conflict. Now, what these 2 things have in common is that they're low visibility in terms of ability to actually count accurately, but high visibility in terms of politically charged, often symbolically charged policy debates. There's particularly problematic, to say the least, to measure in these realms, right? Transnational crime and conflict. However, the demand, the insistence that we have some numbers, some data, is as present in these issue areas as any other policy realm. What I'm going to mostly focus on in the few minutes I have is on illicit flows of various sorts, especially in the case of drugs. We look at both the supply side, who supplies the numbers, but also the demand side. What is the demand? Who are the consumers of these numbers, if you will? In this case, we focus especially on policymakers and very much important, the media. One way to look at this in terms of the consumption of these numbers you could say they're purposely gullible, though I think that's an oxymoron to say you're purposely gullible, but that's characterizes some of what's going on. And that's because they serve a very important function, uses, sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious. So let me focus on, Kelly and I co-edited the conclusion and the introduction and the conclusion. Then I wrote the second chapter, which focuses on the world of illicit flows. Here we talk about people, goods, and money, which are inherently difficult to measure, right? There's no quarterly business reports, job growth statistics, export numbers, import-export balances, and so on. And in fact, the actors are actively trying to evade being seen or counted, right? The success of a smuggling operation, after all, depends very much on not being detected, noticed, quantified, and so forth. Nevertheless, the preoccupation with quantification is as evident in the illicit realm as it is in the licit, right? So there's all these attempts to both measure the size of illicit markets, aggregate data, and at the same time the effectiveness of state controls in suppressing those activities. What I argue in that particular chapter is illicitness makes possible a politics of numbers that is particularly susceptible to manipulation, distortion, and even outright fabrication. Because you can't really falsify the numbers. You can't repeat what the researchers presumably did. And in fact, these numbers are remarkably unquestioned in policy debates and media reporting. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that what we're talking about here is it's not just cynical manipulations by producers and users of numbers, but rather a more nuanced argument that this is really these are coping strategies in a media and policy environment that absolutely demands numbers. There's an imperative, if you will, to quantify. It privileges bad data over no data, promotes simple and visible metrics of policy progress and effectiveness that are ambiguous and misleading. The very act of counting, it seems, even if it's pseudo-counting, makes the invisible world appear more visible and therefore accessible and real in the policy debate. So let me just give you a few examples of this. Basically, a story here, if it's not counted, it does not count. I mean that quite literally, right? So if you just look at the official numbers thrown out there by Interpol, the US State Department, the United Nations, and so on various illicit flows, drugs, sex trafficking, wildlife trade, migrant smuggling, and so on, all these numbers are inherently guesstimates. Very rarely, sometimes, but very rarely, is there any explanation of where the numbers came from, any qualifications about how bad, how much of these are really just extraordinarily rough estimates. So let me give you one particular example from the United States. The US State Department every year publishes something called the International Control Strategy Report. It's basically a report card every March 1st on judging countries around the world on how much they are cooperating with US anti-narcotics efforts. And in that report card, they basically give a country summary of how much they've eradicated, how much they've seized, how many people they've arrested, and so on. It also gives estimates of the size of drug cultivation in Peru and Bolivia, Colombia, and so on. Notice there's some things that are not even mentioned, let alone the dubious data, but some things aren't even mentioned. So, for example, domestic marijuana cultivation. The United States is one of the largest drug producers, illicit drug producers in the world, with marijuana arguably one of America's leading cash crops, though we, as I would suggest, we really don't know the real numbers. Or take, for example, the United Nations annual drug report. They've gotten better over the years, but in the early 1990s, they put out the number, the world illicit drug trade is worth $500 billion, right? It's a nice, round, big, catchy, actually scary number, right? Where did it come from? Absolutely no explanation. This number proliferated. It became the conventional wisdom reported in media accounts and so on, so much so that you have a process, you could even call it, some people call it numbers laundering, in the sense that you lose track of where the number originally came from. Well, how big is the world drug trade? Oh, 500 billion. Who said that? I don't know. I think maybe some UN report somewhere. Anyway, it became naturalized and perpetuated and recycled and indeed laundered so you don't even know necessarily the original source. Now, in subsequent years, they reduced the number, okay, so to 400 billion. Again, a nice, round, big number. An economist who was a consultant, a Colombian economist named Francisco Tumi, was a consultant within the UN agency coming up with this number. He was skeptical. After all, he wasn't a career worker at the UN drug office. He was just a consultant on this stuff. He actually dug around and said, where did you come up with this number? And the best answer that they could give him was, well, the real number, whatever that means, is 365 billion, but we rounded it up to $400 billion. So anyway, as he put it, if it was 340, would have they rounded it down to 300 billion? So anyway, there's a political imperative, if you will, to inflate some of these numbers. The UN basically, like any agency, very much wants media reporting, attention, and so on, and there frankly is no press conference unless you have a number, because the world drug trade in some ways doesn't exist unless you actually designate a number to it. It almost doesn't matter what the number is, as long as it's big and scary and eye-catching, which these numbers certainly were. We step back nationally, again, the State Department. Look at the US statistics on global sex trafficking. A common number used by the US State Department is 600 to 800,000 trafficked per year. Now this number, again, much media reporting, New York Times, NPR, and so forth, became the standard number. The GAO actually did a report which questioned that number, said, look, the methodology is really squishy. We have no idea if this is true. The GAO report did not get picked up in media accounts and so on. Now, some facts are not just inflated, but they turn out to be pure fiction. So, for example, the New York Times picked up on a number of the child internet porn business, and this number was also used in a congressional hearing. The number is $20 billion a year. Now, where did this number originally come from? Well, a congressional staffer that used it for the hearing said, well, it came from this NGO, an anti-child porn NGO. And you go to them and they say, where'd you get it? Well, we got it from this other NGO. So you go to that other NGO and ask, where did you get it? Oh, we got it from McKinsey, business consulting firm. Okay, you go to McKinsey. So where did McKinsey get it? Another NGO. You go to that NGO. Where did they get it? The FBI. You go to the FBI. We never used that number. We've never heard of that number. You can't find it in any FBI document, right? Now, here's a huge problem, which is sometimes it's obvious that the numbers are squishy, problematic, and so on. But a common response when you push the people who produce the numbers is, I can't tell you, it's classified. It's behind a veil of intelligence. It's sort of like, trust me, I know what we're doing, and if I told you what we're doing, well, I'd have to kill you because it's, you know, it's in the intelligence world. So that, by definition, creates a problem for, you know, academic research in terms of repeating or any transparency, if you will, in methodology. So I hope you're a little bit convinced that there's some problems with these numbers. Now the question is, you know, what purpose do they serve by producing these numbers? And as I've alluded to, there's an imperative. You need a number, any number, but again, preferably big and scary, to become part of the debate. Otherwise, you're just not part of the debate. Numbers, it's not just the policy debate, but the broader public debate. So they actually help, it's not just numbers that matter, but numbers help give credibility to a larger story, a narrative, if you will. In this case, a narrative of global crime booming, proliferating, an unprecedented threat, and we're not doing enough about it. Now, maybe all those things are true. We certainly don't want in this book to basically say that these are not serious, very serious problems. But we want to point out that there is a kind of dominant narrative about the illicit side of globalization, if you will, as entirely new and different. And let me throw some numbers at you to show you how new and different it is. And these numbers come from precisely the same sources that I just quoted. They tend to be regurgitated rather than questioned. There's actually a small industry, a cottage industry of kind of popular books in this vein that have come out in the last decade and a half. Probably the best of them, the best written, the best well known, is by Moises Naim, the editor, former editor of Foreign Policy magazine called Illicit, has a long subtitle, and it's basically, he says in the preface or right up front in the book, look, these numbers come from the most reputable, legitimate sources around the world. He says that, and then he uses them throughout the book as evidence that this is an unprecedented global threat. He would not, and others, I don't mean to just pick on Moises Naim, he and others would simply not be able to write their books without those numbers. So they have an incentive, obviously, not to question them too much. There's even books with, the very title of the books is a quantification dependent. So, you know, a book on, I use it sometimes for teaching, on piracy, intellectual piracy and knockoffs. It basically says, you know, inside the world's, you know, fastest growing industry. So that's a quantification claim, right? There's other books that, you know, the world's second largest illicit trade. Interesting, in this realm of advocacy about illicit trade issues, there's actually a kind of competition. Everyone recognizes that drugs are number one. No debate about that. It's a question of how big the drug trade is, but everyone agrees and concedes drugs is number one. However, there's this jockeying for position, depending on what you're advocating, we're number two. So the people who are concerned about art and antiquities, we're number two. The illicit arms trade, we're number two. Sex trafficking, we're number two. Migrant smuggling, we're number two. On and on and on and on. You can find in different places claims about being number two just behind drugs, and so on. Now, the numbers, as I point out, however credible they are, actually give credibility to sort of this master narrative about the globalization of crime. Now, I have only like 1 minute left. I meant to say a lot more about the other side of this, which is measuring policy effectiveness. If you think it's hard to measure the activity, well, it's obviously equally difficult to measure how well agencies are doing their job in suppressing those activities. So understandably, again, it's not a cynical argument, coping strategies. You have officials, DEA, Homeland Security, whatnot, you know, going before Congress every year, justifying their budgets, saying, and what do? They point to arrest numbers, eradication numbers, seizure numbers, how many organizations they've disrupted, and so on. If you actually unpack all those numbers, even the ones that might be hard, so for example, how many hectares you eradicated of coca, that's a hard number, right? It's not fuzzy, but it doesn't actually tell you how much new planting there was that year. Right? They often say we have record eradication this year. Well, there could be a lot new planting. Or similarly, record number of arrests of drug lords or street dealers. They don't tell you how much replacement there is of lower level people quickly going into those slots. And that actually explains much, not all, but much of the violence in Mexico today, is as they take down major drug trafficking leaders, they're replaced, and it's created a competitive dynamic between drug trafficking organizations disrupting them, leading to dramatically higher levels of violence. In the Q&A, since I've run out of time, we can go into a lot more about this. So for example, border seizure numbers. If seizures go up dramatically, Customs and Homeland Security gets applauded. But if seizures go up dramatically, frankly, it also might mean there's a lot more drugs coming across the border. because all things being equal, you're going to seize more if there's more drugs. So there's this weird symbiosis between increased drug trafficking and showing that you're doing a good job. If suddenly you weren't seizing and the drug trade disappeared, at least in the short term, it would look pretty awkward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I just want to begin by saying this is a wonderful book. I hope you have a chance to look at it. It is very persuasive about how crazy these numbers are. I sort of noticed this looking at the U.S. State Department report on trafficking for 2010, which announces that there are 12.3 million traffic victims in the world, and they have identified 49,362. I'm not sure about the exact number. So one wonders how they got from 49,000 to 12.3 million, but it doesn't seem to be explained. But it does really raise for us the question about how numbers matter, what the effects of these numbers are, and how they are intersect with politics. I've been working on the question of how indicators are produced and how they're used for a couple of years now, and some of this work has been done with Kevin Davis and Benedict Kingsbury at the NYU Law School. And I can't help beginning by giving you a little story, because I've spent the last couple of days at the UN Statistical Commission meetings as part of my research on how violence against women is measured. And at these meetings, this is a UN commission that consists of representatives from national statistical offices from all around the world, and they sit and debate things like the principles of statistics. There is a culture of statisticians out there, I've discovered. And just as I left today, a major battle was brewing, just to show that these things matter, between several countries and the UNDP, the UN Development Program, for its Human Development Index, which it apparently has recently revised in ways that make some countries look worse. And they don't like that. They have a new poverty index. And there also are big fights about whether or not the national data matches the international data. So here we get sort of north-south politics happening. One of the problems is that the international data may measure things differently than the national data. So for example, the life expectancy in South Africa by the international figures is 47, and by the national figures is 57. Well, that's pretty significant, and these numbers all get folded into the Millennium Development Goals and other kinds of indicators of economic development and growth, so South Africa cares a lot. So South Africa, Morocco, and Brazil have all accused the UNDP of changing these numbers, not paying attention to the official statistics. I've tried to figure out what official statistics are, and those turn out to be things that countries produce. So if UN agencies produce them, they're not official, although the UNDP guy said they are official. Apparently the worst offense is that some of the data that the UNDP used for the new Human Development Index was produced by some scholars in one of those academic institutions to the north with a lot of red brick around. So there were some Harvard guys who did a study of educational levels, estimating mean number of years in school using all kinds of data, but this was not official data, so they're going to try to roast the UNDP for this. Now, why does this matter? Why are they fighting about this? Clearly there are implications for national reputations, for funding, for all sorts of things that make it worth having this battle, which is now described as removing the disparities between national and international data, as if this is just a matter of kind of conversation, negotiation, and avoids the fact that all these things are measuring the unknowable. You know, mean number of expected years in school, you have to assume that nothing changes, that people stay in school the same way they used to, your populations are fixed. I mean, these are all very difficult. So when I was talking to the UNDP official about this problem and how he's going to deal with it, he said, well, this is all politics. I don't do politics. I'm just a statistician, which I thought, that's an interesting, position to take, that we do statistics, we don't do politics, which is sort of a way that we tend to think about statistics. And one of the things that's great about this book and about the kinds of things that we're finding out as we look at the various different indicators is it's all about politics. But the question is, how does the politics and the technical piece merge? Because it's also about technical skills and expertise, and who has expertise and what kind of expertise, and how do those things go together. So those are very complicated questions, and I am now in my early stages of an ethnography of statisticians, nothing I plan to do. And it seems that there's a possibility that this is a community. There's actually a global statistical community, turns out, which doesn't want to do politics. So let me begin with a couple comments on this book, and hope to encourage you all to buy it and read it. It certainly makes an important contribution in highlighting our current preoccupation with numbers and the political nature of them, the way they're manipulated. It sort of begins by saying a lot of the previous work has been done on how bad numbers are, errors in statistics, consumers who are duped by statistics, identifying the danger signs for consumers to pay attention to, sort of how to lie with statistics. So this genre of work has been around for a while. But this book is doing something different. It's making three moves that I think are all very significant. First of all, it's turning to the international sphere. And certainly in the work that I've been doing the last couple of years, what's really stunning is the way the preoccupation with statistics and measurement and quantification has just taken off in the international world. Endless comparisons of countries about all kinds of things that they do, increasingly important in the management of global affairs. There are endless rankings of countries. Since the mid-90s, new demands for numbers all the time. I've been studying violence against women for a while, and since, about 2000, the drumbeat is we need more numbers about how much violence against women there is out there, as if that's a knowable thing. So more data available on the internet, and interest in measuring things that are really very difficult to measure, such as the rule of law, the ease of doing business. I had a list here, which I can't seem to find. So we've had a fluorescence of these indicators that compare and rank countries. Oh, rule of law, corruption, governance, failed states, human development, measures of compliance with global standards like human rights, corporate social responsibility has indicators. So this notion that if we just had more measurement, we could have better monitoring and evaluation of what organizations do is very fundamental to the contemporary governance mode. And people have talked about this as an audit culture, new modes of management, lessons learned in which you generate data and it folds back into decision making. So we have some kind of new governance strategies that are very evidence-based governance premised on gathering this information. So this demand for numbers is strong and growing stronger, and they provide us this sense of certainty and clarity. People have talked about trust in numbers, and that was sort of what Peter said. You get a number like, 436,220, and you figure, this person must know. And I've spent some time pondering why this desire for more statistics, more numbers. And I have found myself attracted to ideas like desire and seduction. I mean, we live in this incredibly complicated, unknowable world where we have to make decisions and we have to act. And wouldn't it be nice if we actually could rank every country in the world in terms of human development in some kind of accurate, predictable way? And I think that's part of why we keep turning to wanting more numbers as a way of answering these questions. In the realm of true confessions, I must say that when I sit on an admissions committee and look at graduate student applications, I find myself, despite lots of skepticism about GREs, looking at those GRE scores. And I know they don't mean anything. There's no necessary correlation between GRE scores and how well a student does. Who knows what they measure, right? So I'm full of skepticism, but they're so easy, and there they are, and they're so comparable, and so, you sort of end up looking at them anyway, and I bet I'm not the only one. So we have this notion of desire. So the second important move of this book, I'm going to run out of time before I even get to my data, is to ask about the effects of these numbers, which they do a lot of interesting talk, mostly about how numbers create issues, and I know Lara's going to talk about this as well. But numbers also are about monitoring and accountability, this new form of governance. So they're both about doing reform, creating issues, and about establishing control. The rise in interest in numbers really happened during the 19th century with the growth of the modern nation state. Not surprisingly, the Prussians were apparently way ahead of everybody else in doing statistics, but just sort of collecting information was basic, and starting in the early 19th century, actually, so that we see a long-term notion of the state having to gather knowledge about its population, and we now are seeing this moving into the global domain. So the third move that this book makes is challenging the question of the problem of counting the uncountable. So we know these are uncountable phenomena that they're looking at. And I actually believe that the rule of law and violence against women and corruption are also uncountable. But what does it mean that we are providing numbers? We've counted these things. And I think that's a really important question. My student Vibhuti Ramachandran, who's here, worked with me this summer studying the way the U.S. State Department trafficking indicators are being used in India, and we spent some time talking to different people about what exactly it means to be trafficked, and can you identify a woman who is trafficked? And we had a long conversation with a woman who graduated from high school. Actually, she didn't graduate. She left. She went off to the Gulf states from Calcutta. She had made some money as a sex worker. She came back home. She found a friend. She wanted to take the friend with her. Is that trafficking? You know, we know that trafficking is often about people who move and then maybe they can't get a job and they go into sex work for a while and then they go to other work. So identifying the thing, right, the trafficked person, is extremely difficult even at the ground. But nevertheless, we are trying to do it. So there are clearly a lot of problematic and political dimensions to the creation of dissemination of numbers, and we need lots more skepticism and scrutiny, but what I might call the GRE factor here is always going to stand against us. Now, I want to give you a brief overview of a whole different problematic, which is that number creation is done over a long period of time, often, I mean, indicator creation, maybe I'm talking fast, how much, probably 5 minutes? 2? 5. I want to take a Latourian perspective. Bruno Latour talks about the creation of scientific knowledge, which is a process that takes place over time in which issues that are uncertain become settled, and then you can move and build on those, and you get more and more settlement of ideas, and then new questions, and then they become settled. So, for example, how to measure temperature, we didn't know. We invented the thermometer. We now figure that the thermometer measures temperature, and we don't really worry about whether that's true or not. And you see the same thing if you look at the genealogies of indicator production. There are things that are debated and contested, and then after a while, they sort of become settled and accepted. But my argument is that there are multiple ways that this settlement and acceptance can take place. And if you look at different ones, you can see they have very different assumptions about what the point is, what you're measuring, what the institution who cares about it is, and what you're doing about it. So I've been studying how to measure violence against women globally, and that's what my PowerPoint's about. And I have figured out, so this is part of the new governance. I'm going to go fast because I'm not going to talk about this. And these are ways of collecting data. These are all very murky. But it seems to me that if we're looking at how to measure violence against women, there are 4 different approaches which are quite different in their philosophy, their goals, the organizations behind them. One focused on gender equality, one on human rights, one on criminal justice, and one on national statistical capacity. And each one of these has assumptions about what causes the problem, how to fix it, how to get information, which institutions are going to support it, what kinds of expertise they value, and what constitutes improvement. And so if we look at the trajectory of development of each of these over time, you find they're actually measuring something quite different. If you think about violence against women for a moment, this is not a simple and straightforward category. It includes everything from domestic violence to honor killing to trafficking to various kinds of ritual things to female genital cutting, etc. So to be very brief, this may be too quick. So the first model is one of gender equality. And this is an argument that says, if you're going to get gender equality, you have to diminish violence, or actually violence may produce gender inequality. This is kind of a feminist approach, so you want to get focus on measuring all sorts of kinds of emotional and other kinds of behavior that are making women feel subordinated. You are concerned with general social tolerance towards gender violence, and interviews have to be done in a lot of concern about ethical and safety dimensions. And this is being supported by the Commission on the Status of Women, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and the Secretary General's report. And it usually relies on sociologists and anthropologists. So the idea is you improve gender equality, you'll diminish violence. A human rights approach is quite similar. Also sees this as a violation of fundamental freedoms, concern with how the states are failing to act. A lot of interest in getting states to act more energetically on this problem, defined in a very broad way so that it looks at work and labor contexts, conflicts, various sexual, so it's a very broad basket of phenomenon. It's being supported by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the report of the Secretary General. And the experts who are working on these indicators are largely human rights lawyers. They haven't actually gotten to the point of counting anything yet. They're still working on the conceptual side and the process, probably not surprising given their disciplinary orientation. The criminal justice approach says this is a crime, we need to measure it like we need to measure other crimes, use a crime victimization survey approach, maybe use categories that match U.S. crime trends like homicide, assault, battery, rape, some that are sort of accepted within crime documents. This is supported by the UNODC, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and efforts to do international crime victimization surveys, and it is promoted by criminologists. And the idea is they really want to know, are the criminal justice systems helping victims? And the assumption is that making better criminal justice systems would improve the situation of victims. Can you see how we're going to get different measurement approaches from these different ideas? Now, this is the UN Statistical Commission's approach. And they're actually primarily interested in supporting national statistical offices, and the person who's behind this says he doesn't really know anything about gender or gender violence. He doesn't really care. That's a problem for sociologists. He wants just to have good guidelines for counting. And this means a relatively narrow survey. The idea is to develop guidelines and models, and countries will do this for themselves. You train the national statistical bureaus. You have to get national buy-in, and you do it sort of along with maybe like a housing and demographic survey. The experts tend to be statisticians, and the argument is that better national data will begin to produce some kind of actions from the governments, but it's sort of not clear what governments are going to do. It's just a matter of producing better national data to make governments accountable. And if you can get a government to do measurements over time, then you can look at improvement over time. And if you can get all that information that I just whipped through and make sense to you, I'm happy that you did that. Let me just conclude by saying, as I was thinking about these four approaches, the first two of which are quite broad and the second two are fairly narrow in the kind of behavior that they will count, I began to think about the resources available to carry out surveys under these various frameworks. And at that point, it became clear to me that there's a whole lot more money to do crime surveys or national statistical surveys than there is to do feminist gender equality surveys or human rights surveys. So what this means is that of these four options, it's the second two that are going to actually happen. And now that I realize that, I can see that the feminists are busy trying to persuade the national statistical people to put their questions into their questionnaire, because in the end, resources differ. And so the organizations that have the more resources and the more capacity to do this kind of survey are going to be the ones that end up deciding how the phenomenon is defined, how it is counted, how it is understood, how it's theorized, and how the solution is imagined. And I think these kinds of policy implications are really important for us to think about, but they're really embedded in the whole trajectory of how measurement processes take place. So I'm sorry that was so fast, but I hope you could get something out of it. Thanks.
So I'm Elizabeth Eagen. I'm from the Open Society Foundations, and I started this initiative at Open Society Foundations as a joint project between two different programs, specifically to address what I think are some of the underlying questions in the book, although I don't primarily deal with statistics. I deal a lot with this issue of data. I'll talk a little bit more about the initiative in a bit because it is sort of relevant, but I think what we're seeing here and what I saw as I went through the book and what created my impulse to start the initiative was sort of a deep shift in global institutional arrangements and information technology. So we're coming from the perspective that information technology can actually assist organizations, and particularly human rights organizations, to address some of the policy questions they encounter when they're asked for numbers, some of the policy questions they encounter when they're asked, well, how many victims of domestic violence are there? And they really have to be able to make this, to do some maneuvering to position their current access to what I would say is a fire hose of available data coming from multiple sources, and really frame that in the way that human rights documentation and research has been done all along. There is a strong methodology to human rights data collection, and in reality, we really have to make sure that when we talk about statistics, indicators, numbers, and metrics, we are really actually looking at them through the framework of what a documented human rights case can actually do, prevent, protect, and preserve. So I found the book really interesting because, I'm not used to looking through my glasses, hold on. I found the book really interesting because it sort of confirmed for me that both on the academic and policy side, we're seeing a lot of the same questions that the human rights and governance and policy actors on the NGO side are really confronting, which are their concerns about numbers and metrics and indices. I think that it's given us these like 3 or 4 kind of questions or challenges that we've seen in terms of what human rights practice can do. And so I wanted to just give you a little bit of a little taste of what those might be in terms of how they focus on technology, but also in how they deal with data. Basically, the first challenge, I would say, is that the investigatory tradition of human rights work follows this methodology. And we need to be able to help that methodology bring human rights data to a longer life cycle. Information is now being requested. It can't just be the press release that admits that there's been a human rights violation. We have to talk a little bit more about what does that mean in the long run? What does that mean for the development policy? What does that mean for the information that we're trying to gather to change the governmental policy that's creating the problem in the first place? The second problem that I'm seeing is that there's this sort of shift recently in the panoply of partners that a government can choose to create its own identity. That there's performance metrics as well as these sort of development monitoring bodies that we talked about a little bit earlier. There's also this question about how human rights organizations have begun to advocate with non-traditional targets. It's not necessarily the Human Rights Committee or the UN or the government directly. There may be other places that a human rights organization might want to advocate. The World Bank, for example, is a new target. It's about a recent target, I would say. The third is this question of data when we find that human rights organizations are being questioned about their accuracy. That's been a long-term tactic for diminishing the success of a human rights institution, and it really speaks to what Lara was saying about the way that the opposing narrative, which you always have to think of when you develop your human rights tactic, can be used against you if you make the slightest mistake. And then the final piece that I wanted to bring up was this question about sort of the globalized environment that they work in terms of advocacy. We've seen over time that many human rights organizations are concerned that their domestic constituents aren't really understanding what they're doing at an international level, and partly that may be because they're confronting something that they haven't quite, quote unquote, sold to the domestic narrative as something that they need to work on. And so there's an opportunity as well for new tools and tactics and new types of data and drinking from this fire hose of social and economic information to really sell a human rights question as part of the policymaking on the ground. So the Human Rights Data Initiative was created to kind of address these threats and challenges. And there's 3 pieces that we sort of see as Lego blocks, or I don't know, insert some toy metaphor. It'll help you they build off of each other. Let's go with that. The first is about rebuilding information infrastructure, which is pretty simple and straightforward. The question there is about how do we enable more powerful ways for organizations to preserve their data, but also how do we enable them to engage with larger sets of data, both numbers and other types of information. The second is about extending the use of human rights information, which means developing data-supported outputs to enhance and extend narrative reporting, and then developing data outputs that can be shared collaboratively. So a human rights organization cannot produce the type of data that a statistical survey may need. But that data has to be remixable in such a way that it remains relevant to this inevitable narrative that we see of numbers and demand for numbers that we see. And then the final piece that we want to concentrate on is we're really hoping that we can help human rights and governance organizations really extend their activity in a direction they've been going for a while, which is to support them in evidence-based policymaking initiatives. We see it's been described as human rights organizations are teetering on the fence of thinking about becoming think tanks, for example, or they make an attempt to do a statistical analysis. I think that there's a way in which human rights organizations are called upon because they understand the rule of law, they understand a depth of political narrative in a country, and finding ways to assist them to move forward with that can actually complicate what has been this straightforward narrative about how many numbers can we throw on the table and use to base our policies off of. And then the final piece is that we do get a lot of questions about whether we're working on statistics, and we're really not. The majority of our work isn't really about statistics, and I think that there's a conflation between data and statistics that many policymakers as well as NGOs come across. And so that's a final piece of advocacy, which is shaping that nuance and making sure that it's heard. I had a couple takeaways from the book that I wanted to just throw out there. These are initial thoughts. I'm going to reread it. But the first is that the pressure to produce numbers is really real, and it's very real for NGOs themselves. It's real in terms of their need to explain to their donors what it is they do, but it's also really hard to say no when you're invited to the table. And if that invitation is extended in the form of, please tell us how do we measure and how do we say how many victims there are of a certain crime, it's hard to let that go. I think we brought up before this question of grabbing the attention of your advocacy target or of even the press. I think that it's clear to me that organizations really shouldn't be producing and collecting statistics if they're not set up for it. But I think what's really exciting to me about the book, I'll come to the third one in a sec, but what was really exciting is that the book itself prescribes this litmus test about how to say, okay, let's take a step back at the number. If I'm requested to give a number, or if I'm looking at a number, let's stop and think about what that is. And if you hadn't read the book, I encourage you to pick it up and check out the whole thing, but also specifically this question. And to me, whenever I get a project or I talk to an organization about their plans in terms of evidence-based policymaking, what we always discuss is who's served by collecting the number, as opposed to how do you frame your success in light of service to your client base, service to the people that you're protecting. And I think that among funders as well as among policymakers, we really need to be able to step back and say that is the true goal. The true goal really is not this number is large and therefore we must pay attention, which speaks to my second point or my third point, but really what is the point of doing human rights work if you're not actually fulfilling a human rights issue, if you're not preventing or alleviating a human rights problem? And the final piece here is that numbers really do urge us to do something. And so what I think we need to do is sort of replace that generator with something else. So since I'm coming to this from a human rights core funding aspect, my idea here and my hope here is to help organizations that I work with feel that they can push back at the quantification of the human rights movement. That's hard to do. It's hard to sit there and make sure that you continue to complicate the narrative, but that's always been the human rights movement's goal. We have to be able to think closely and long and hard about what is it we're trying to say with each human rights case that we bring. And so I think that there's also this other interesting hazard in developing societies where we're seeing that the people across the table from the human rights organization on the government side are becoming more and more technocratic, and they are becoming the kinds of people that can poke holes in shoddy numbers and enjoy doing it very much. And so really being able one piece about this generating of different urgencies is the ability to stop back and say, we can't give you that number, and this number is not important because. So I wanted to give you a few examples to really show you what it is that we've been seeing as the human rights and governance organizational response to this pressure for numbers. We're seeing some visualization, we're seeing mashup of data, and we're seeing something that's really interesting to me, which is this this recognition that there are silos of information within different organizations, and in coalition, if there is a neutral platform that lets people submit information to it, it's a little more technical than that, but sharing data repositories and really determining what information is shareable with respect to privacy, with respect to possibilities, what we can do with that information. And then the last two pieces are about sort of regrouping and refocusing the storyline a little bit more. So this is an example of a visualization from Human Rights Watch that's from about 8 years ago. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a map of downtown Tashkent. This was a target. This was directed at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development when they had their annual meeting in Uzbekistan. And so on the right, you have the number. You have currently more than 7,000 political prisoners are being held in colonies on the basis of their religious beliefs. That's the number. But on the left, you have a little bit more complexity to this. It's a tourist map of downtown Tashkent that shows you the proximity of human rights violation sites to tourist sites. That's a different narrative. Maybe that's a generator of a different kind of conversation in the policy sphere. This is a really recent one, which is I'm calling the long tail of evidence pre-tweet. I don't know if I can get away with that title. Basically, I noticed this really during the last couple of weeks, where I saw that Peter Buchart, who's the Emergency Researchers Director for Human Rights Watch, confirmed that there were undercover police loyal to the Egyptian president, committing acts of violence and looting. And he did this by going to the hospital, talking to the hospital staff, and finding out that they had found identity cards on some of the people who were coming into the hospital to be treated. And it turned out they were carrying police identification cards and had sort of been caught, I guess, in the crossfire. And to me, this really shows me something really interesting, which is about sort of the long tail of information gathering and relationship building that human rights organizations do before they put forward a quick and pithy remark. And without that reputational standard behind what they're saying, it doesn't matter how many times it was tweeted, it has to be real. So this was victory for the sort of the footwork of human rights work. And then here's some footwork plus technology, which is it's a map of village damage in South Ossetia. And this was when Human Rights Watch had access to some of the UN satellite and other independent scientific satellite pictures of this area, and they went through and they analyzed what had been burned and what had been not burned and what was razed to the ground, and making the decision to call it razed to the ground or not. But it wasn't until they had the on-the-ground presence to match that time data and match their knowledge of what was going on that they were able actually to make a statement about this information. You can't really do anything with this except say on this day there were pieces that were destroyed without that sort of check of the information specialists in a human rights world. So I'm going to end a little bit on a trick. I think one of the things that we've seen is that much of the book is checking in on major indices and institutions and numbers like drugs and trafficking and death, and there's no doubt that NGOs have something to say about those issues. But what's interesting to me about this whole question of statistical debate and indices and information is that human rights organizations themselves have identified their major gripe with the current situation. And that is that every time we have to talk about confronting and producing indices, it's not clear why countries must be comparable at a number level rather than to an international human rights standard. It's not clear why we should be conflating countries into a pile of magical ranking. Indicator climbing, which is also mentioned in the book, is kind of the least of the problems. You know, it's easy to toggle one switch and change your law and climb up the ease of doing business ranking. But from the NGO perspective, I think we have to even push it a little bit farther. Every new index only creates one more shadow report or one more NGO input mechanism or one more lever that needs to be pressed upon by those NGOs, and not to respond is a very difficult thing. So the more that we seek to create new indicators, or the more that we seek to create new mechanisms, we also have to be mindful of our sources of information and the pressures that are on them. So I did a bad grad school thing, and I pulled out one quote from the book. And I'm wondering if anybody saw this as a call to action. The majority of traffic statistics are developed by NGOs and agencies. They're overextended, and they are troubled by this. They're not ready to do it at the same time that they're also being diverted from their primary tasks. And actually, my answer to this would be no. I don't think that this is a call to action, because this would be a call to me. This would say, well, maybe if you fund them, if you give more support to their capacity to collect and maintain and produce better statistics, then you would be doing something for the greater good. I don't think that they would want it. I don't think that it would have the kind of results that we'd hope from the human rights movement. And I actually don't think that anybody writing in the book would say that that was a good thing, that diverting human rights attention towards producing better statistics simply to fulfill the demand for numbers would be the right thing to do. So I'm going to end there. I think we'll have a bunch of questions. And thanks.
Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, so let's move on to the question and discussion part of the evening. So if you have a question, ask you to step up to the microphone here and please state your name, institutional affiliation, and please note that you are being recorded for the record. So, Tanya?
I have a couple of kind of pushback questions. I don't
Sorry,
know how much,
Tanya, what's your name?
Tanya Putnam. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department. Sorry, I forgot the rules already. This kind of goes directly to some of the last things that Elizabeth was just saying. But is the problem here really numbers or bad numbers? And I heard a lot of criticism of numbers, but are there any good numbers out there? And if there are, how would we know, right? Because if it's all just a bunch of noise, how would we really know a good number when we saw it? You know, and I know for academics, you know, with Professor Mary's comments, what's problematic for politicians is actually usually really good for academics. We actually look for measures that show us different things in order to really refine our theories and figure out what's going on. So there's a cross purpose there. And also, if the numbers are problematic, are they more problematic than what came before? In other words, if this is a new phenomenon, what was there before? And if what was there before were a lot of disconnected anecdotes that we didn't know how to knit together, or we couldn't tell how representative they were, you know, isn't that also problematic, right? Okay. And then one final really directed question to Lara Nettelfield is part of the story with Srebrenica and the skepticism about, is part of the story about Srebrenica and the fact that the more you reported numbers, the more pushback you found. Was that rooted in skepticism about the numbers themselves? In other words, did people not believe them or thought that the numbers were politicized? You know, so in a sense, actually exercising, maybe not more critical facilities the way we were talking about, but at least using the numbers also as a point of pushing back against assignment of blame.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for that rich set of questions. So I'll ask the panelists to respond in order and perhaps also engage some points from the other panelists by way of response too. So Peter?
Great questions. I'm afraid I probably won't answer all of them, but I was particularly struck by your question, are all numbers bad? Are there good numbers? And I guess my reaction to that was I hope I didn't give the impression that numbers are inherently bad. The idea here in this book is that it's just to be more educated, skeptical consumers of numbers rather than dupes. That we need more, numeracy, if that's a word, and that numbers are neither good or bad. They are constructs. They don't exist on their own. And so, for example, And this is related to your question of, are some numbers harder than others? So if take the case of drugs. Some numbers actually are quite useful and quite hard and easily measurable. So for example, in the drug trade, drug seizure statistics don't tell us a whole lot in my view, but price and purity statistics on street level tell you a lot. So you can look at cities across America and look at price of cocaine, how it fluctuates. The whole idea of the war on drugs is to basically increase prices, and so they have undercover controlled sales where they then basically undercover purchases to basically trace over time sales, and you can track it across different drugs, marijuana, cocaine, and basically by those numbers you really see the very limited effect of drug enforcement in terms of actually being able to significantly raise drug prices, because in general it hasn't happened except to some degree in the case of marijuana. You almost have marijuana protectionism. It's the easiest drug to interdict from abroad and helps domestic marijuana producers, frankly. What came before, interestingly enough, I mean, this is part of modernization, I suppose. Most of the topics we're covering in here, I mean, obviously we've had refugee flows and mass atrocities for many centuries. But what matters here is basically public awareness beyond actually physical presence in those places, right? So it's partly, as someone here who spoke right after me, it's actually the very creation of the modern state in terms of statistics. It's actually the word statistics. It's supposed to be statistics in the function of the state, and also the media playing the role of proliferating those numbers so that people far away from these activities, whether it's sex trafficking or genocide or so forth, are aware of them. So before these numbers, for people not intimately involved in the activities themselves, there was nothing.
So I agree these are interesting questions, and I think in a way I'm...
Sorry, Sally, can you speak into the mic? Sorry.
I'm thinking about this slightly differently than just about generating numbers, because I'm interested in the kind of second tier process, which is you take the numbers and you construct them into some sorts of measurement device. The indicator, so it's not just the raw number, but the ranking, the series system, and what that process looks like. I began looking at these with a lot of skepticism. This kind of knowledge is very different from the sorts of qualitative narrative knowledge that I think provides the context and the framing that is much better way of understanding things. But I've come to see that this is also fundamental to reform movements. And so if I can be an anthropologist for a moment, it's kind of like witchcraft or supernatural forces, which can be used for good or for evil, depending on how they get used. I think it's important to recognize that some things are much more measurable than others. So you could count things like the number of people that show up to this lecture probably fairly easily, whereas counting something like the rule of law or who's trafficked is much more difficult. And I think one of the things we're seeing is a movement of a mechanism of knowledge production that may work in some domains much more readily than others, and it's moving into other domains where it's actually more and more difficult. But it's absolutely fundamental to reform movements. The human rights documentation process is just one example. Have watched NGOs try to build issues, and the first thing they do is to count, right? To build your issue, you have to show how big it is, how important it is. So, the numbers are affecting us in all sorts of ways. It's really a way that decision-making works. So the last question is, what did we do before? And it may be that we had small cadres of elites making their own private decisions. And one of the arguments for these use of indicators and numbers is that increases democratic openness, makes things open to scrutiny, produces knowledge that publics can use. And I mean, that can happen as well in certain circumstances. I think it's a matter of but you still have to wonder who's measuring what, how are they defining it, and what kind of knowledge is being produced. But there is always this possibility of greater public scrutiny when things are known through this mechanism?
I think that the problem is kind of both, bad numbers and numbers themselves. I think I said in my presentation pretty repetitively that I want the conversation to move away from numbers. But I do think that when we talk about patterns over time, an organization can really think about those patterns over time if they have the opportunity. Say, for example, their logbooks of intakes of clients get scanned and scraped, and they can deal with it, and they could make statements about the data that they have. And I think that may be helpful to them. It's kind of a larger and more expensive project than their core task, but it could be helpful to them to really, if, for example, the government is saying we're providing legal aid for these problems because we think they're the worst, if the organization can look and say, we've been providing legal aid for these, and this is what most people walk into our office for, and you should really take a look at those. So rather than numbers, I think a cumulative volume of activity over time can strengthen an organization's argument.
Okay, great. Let's take some more questions.
So I'm Kevin Davis from NYU Law. Just wanted to follow up on this question about the good numbers, actually. I was curious if there are other good processes for creating numbers that you found. I mean, Elizabeth, you mentioned that when there's resistance from the other side, so to speak, that I take it has prompted some NGOs to do a better job of collecting the numbers. And transparency obviously seems to, well, not obviously, but also might be a factor. But I was wondering if there are other patterns that you've seen in terms of what sort of circumstances lead to production of better numbers over time, whether it might be competition amongst NGOs. I don't know if that has an effect, but it would be worth thinking about. Or mechanisms for participation in the production of numbers, or at least the correction, where you allow for people who are using the data to sort of chime in with corrections. The World Bank does that sometimes with their doing business data to some extent. Or even if just the involvement of public actors to any extent seems to make a difference. So any thoughts you might have on the patterns and the processes that seem to lead to the production of better numbers over time would be interesting. And actually, Elizabeth, just to the extent that you can, just a comment. In the context that I'm interested in, we do sometimes need to rank countries, or at least to be able to compare across countries. When you've got a finite amount of resources that have to be allocated across countries, and you have to set priorities. So, and I would think that in some of the human rights contexts, you need to do that as well. Set priorities across countries. At least some organizations have to do that, including maybe the Open Society. So I was just wondering if you use numbers, rankings, or something for that purpose in your own work.
All right, great. Let's take a couple more and bundle them into responses. Yeah, Elise?
Hi, Elise Giuliano, Barnard College Political Science Department. I have a question for Sally Murray, or anyone really, since you talked about the possible beneficial uses of rankings, but we haven't heard too much specifically about that tonight. Earlier in the semester, when someone was here from Freedom House, she spoke about how sometimes representatives from different countries call her on the phone to lobby for boosting the rankings. So I just wondered if you could, tell us, or maybe Elizabeth, tell us some examples of cases where rankings or internationally produced or codified numbers or rankings inspire or motivate actors to better themselves, or just to perhaps try to achieve a fit into a category that may inspire greater transparency.
Where was the person from?
Freedom House, about rankings of level of democracy.
Great, that's good. And Jack, do you want to give one, and then we'll come back for the next round? Yeah.
Jack Snyder from Political Science at Columbia. So, whether we need numbers as opposed to stories should depend in part on what we want to do with the numbers, what we need them for. Do we need numbers for just description of the phenomenon? Do we need numbers in order to establish what causes the phenomenon and what the antidotes are to it? And So just to know, in a rough sense, what is happening, a bunch of good narratives can probably tell you a lot about what is happening. You need numbers to know, exactly how much of it is happening, but it raises the question of, well, why do you need to know that? If you know that the order of magnitude is something like between 5,000 and 15,000 people were massacred in Srebrenica, for what purpose do you need a more precise number? You may need numbers to know whether what you're describing is representative, but a lot of well-chosen narratives can give you a sense of what's representative as well. As for causes, well, the best way to do causal inference is to combine narrative descriptions of the causal mechanism in detail with a statistical analysis of, frequency and correlation. But you can tell a lot about causation just by tracing causal process and looking at the mechanism. You can learn a lot about causation just by finding out the motives of the actors, why they said they were doing what they were doing, and get inside their brain to think of how you're going to give them incentives not to do it. As far as antidotes are concerned, to try to decide whether an intervention that an NGO or whoever might want to take to deal with a problem is going to work or not, you might want to have good statistics to evaluate effectiveness, but you could also do a field experiment where you've set up your intervention on an experimental population, and you can test it that way. So moreover, in terms of having an impact on like the climate of opinion, sometimes it's a single smoking gun incident that has more impact than the numbers, because everybody knows that the numbers are contested, but the video of the Serbs that was circulated that actually showed them literally with the smoking gun had more impact on Serb public opinion, realizing, oh, we really did do that and it was terrible, than all the numbers debate did. So I'm in favor of numbers, but I think that it's important to think about, well, why do you need the numbers, rather than just to play this political football game with them, and can narratives provide nearly the same kind of descriptive and causal inference value that the numbers can.
Great, thank you. So three very interesting interventions here, and I'm going to give you all a very unfair 2 minutes each to respond to those. So,
okay, very briefly, question: what produces better numbers? And I guess the only guiding rule I would say as a starting point is that the counters should not have a vested interest in the number itself. And in the case of the law enforcement agencies that I look at in terms of, with Homeland Security or Customs or State Department's Trafficking Persons Office or so on, if they're doing the counting, but then they actually not only have a vested interest in the number that's come out, but then the spin that they give to their own numbers, it's inherently a problem. There was a question about can rankings actually stimulate improvement? I guess I'm of mixed view on that. You, again, take the Trafficking Persons State Department report. They rank countries every year in 3-tier system, and countries around the world scramble to make sure they're not in the 3rd tier, because you're basically blacklisted. So it leads to all kinds of frenzy of behavior to make sure you're not in that 3rd tier. Arguably that's a good thing, in the sense that Japan, Israel, so on, somebody cleared up their act to look better. Are they fundamentally changing their behavior? It's much less clear. And then Jack's question about narratives versus numbers, and why aren't sometimes narratives more useful. I guess it's a longer conversation, but in the cases we looked at in this book, and certainly in the chapter I did on illicit trade, what I found fascinating is that numbers alone aren't good enough. You need a narrative to hold the numbers together. So the numbers and narrative are not oppositional. It's kind of narratives versus numbers. It's actually, you weave in those numbers in this narrative that gives it life. And then, as you pointed out, yeah, you can have images too as a sort of added thing. But the numbers on their own, I think people in any kind of numbers, whether illicit numbers or whatnot, at some point your eyes start to glaze over, and that's why you really need the narrative effect.
Sally.
So, just to be brief, I was going to say that the State Department trafficking indicators have, I gather, had positive effect, because some of the critics have written articles, like Ian Gallagher, saying that it has actually produced some passage of laws in different countries. I agree it's probably very iffy about whether there's been substantive effect. This is actually an interesting question in the human rights field, because human rights has to operate by various kinds of shaming and naming, and yet the field has been quite reluctant to do ranking of indicators. And I've been studying a project by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to come up with indicators, but they are very resistant to being ranking. They presented this idea to the Human Rights Committee that monitors the ICCPR, and they got substantial pushback saying we don't want countries ranked. So that suggests that it might be powerful, actually, to rank countries by human rights, but it may also be too politically difficult. But it is an area that it might happen. I think the human rights community has itself resisted this. I would say that numbers do produce theory, but as I tried to show in my brief talk, the choice of numbers is in fact derived from theory. So your theory shapes the way you pick numbers and what you choose to measure. So it's not like there's a, as I'm sure you know, a space where you could do the numbers, then build theory. I think for social movements, you clearly need both numbers and stories, and the image of some child in a tenement was very important in getting tenements cleaned up, and we see this all the time. But my last point, I think, is that I think it's important to differentiate the use of numbers and quantification for research and for governance. And I've really been looking at this in the governance area. I think from research, clearly it's different. These are not actually distinct domains, having made this distinction, because academic research can fold into a lot of governance policy stuff. Academic research serves to legitimate policy numbers. Some policy numbers that don't have academic background have less credibility, so they overlap, but I think in their intention at least, they can be separated. And I could go on about how you need qualitative data to interpret the meaning of quantitative information, but I'm sure you all know that. Why, for example, in a study I looked at, do 50% of the women in Mozambique who've been battered go to helping systems, and in another country, an industrialized country, I think it was about 10%. You look at these figures, you say, I need more than statistics to make sense of this thing that looks sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah. Elizabeth.
I want to sort of wrap all the questions into a big pile, and I think that there's two pieces of discussions that we have going on right now. One is about disbursement of resources, and how do you choose to disperse resources? And I think that that's an underlying question for why indicators exist at all, or why we collect these types of statistics, or why we measure numbers and fight over how big they are. And then I think that there's also this other question of measurement and evaluation. How do you evaluate the success? It's kind of a cheap shot, but I want to move back to this idea of what is the human rights movement for? The human rights movement says that one instance of torture is too much. And so we've counted one. We should kind of be done counting for a little bit while we deal with the problem, and we deal with determining what it is that we can do. Do we need to take a litigation case? Do we need to see if there are other victims that he knows? Do we need to uncover how we're going to prosecute a case that's largely taking place in unmeasurable, much like much of the book, and unmeasurable instances of, like, sort of you pull up a rock and you're seeing a lot of different unmeasurable things. I don't really think that indicators in the end are the only reason that funding or government or otherwise gets dispersed. I would be really surprised. I think that there's a complicated valuation of why we do what we do in terms of what our government puts out with our own tax money, for example. And it's much more complicated than this game of indicators and this game of ranking. And then I just want to go back to two more things. One of the projects, I don't actually have a body of conducted projects to really talk about. My project's only a year and a half old. So I think once we've started making this a piece of what we do, we'll start to see some results a year from now, maybe. But there's two pieces that I'm excited about. One is this idea of creating a space within the human rights organizations and governance organizations who want to do something outside of their traditional human rights monitoring research, to really experiment both with new tools but also with whether they can indeed engage in a research project that produces a number. And by carving that out and making it something that doesn't measure or evaluate whether they've failed, I think that that's a really important way to fund in this area. And then the other thing is that we recently put out a call for proposals on challenging commonly accepted facts in the public policy sphere. We opened it to think tanks across Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And the response has been overwhelming. There are indeed mass amounts of data that people really think can challenge what is the dominant narrative in their society. And they really think that with the help of somebody to control and filter that fire hose of information, they will be able to make a big change. So it's kind of exciting, and we'll see where they go a year from now.
Yeah, okay. Very quickly, because we're almost out of time.
Yes, my name is Jim Dingman, and I'm with Pacifica Radio. During the 80s and early 90s, I would help Human Rights Watch researchers in evaluating conflicts in Central America and the Gulf War. And one of the problems is they're not intelligence agencies. They would like to have gotten the data. The first time I ever saw them act on that kind of data was at the end of the Gulf War when they got the big data dump from the Kurdish area. But always the work of the investigators that I worked with was essentially they were lawyers building up cases based on narratives. They would have loved to have statistical data, but they couldn't get it because the states weren't going to give them the statistical data in order for them to build their cases. So that to me is one of the problems in looking at this, because you can't get that kind of information. The state's not going to give it up to you in order to do that. And I don't recall, because the last time I worked with them, we were trying to figure out the Shia revolt after the first Gulf War. I spent 6 months in the office trying to figure it out, and we could never get the data, the statistical data to do it. So right there is a problem that's very difficult to overcome.
Great, thank you. And Kathy?
Kathy Nepomniachtchi, Slavic Department, Barnard College. There's nothing more guaranteed to warm the cockles of a humanities scholar's heart than to hear a lot of social scientists question numbers and use words like narrative and rhetoric. Thank you, Jack. I really appreciated that. But I'd like to push a little harder on the negative possibilities of things that are really harder to count. And this is a big question. I realize it's the end of the evening. But ironically, Lara, it came up on your territory. And when one of your acquaintances who works at the ICTBY, I'm sorry, I added a letter there, just ignore it, came and talked about how they worked on indicators of success, and it was successful prosecutions, which by that quantitative figure, they're pretty unsuccessful. But we raised the issue about what about the very existence of the tribunal? And what were the long-term effects of its existence in the society? As someone comes out of the former Soviet Union where there have been no tribunals of this sort, where there has been no historical reckoning. But how do you count that?
Okay.
And what do you do, what are the negative effects when you can't count something and you have to do something else?
Thanks. And I'm going to ask one last one, actually directed to Peter, and it's along the lines of what Kevin asked. It seems to me there are a number of different mechanisms that indicators and rankings use to affect political change, right? One is they might serve as a focal point for domestic civil society to get, angry and mad at the government, sort of take this up, take the case to the media. Another one might be purely on playing on countries' reputation, competitiveness, and jealousness, right? One of the presentations Elise was referring to, Corinne Karlaker, was talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan and how they watch each other's rankings like hawks, and the instant one of them goes down in a ranking, they come out with a news report. I mean, that's a very distinct causal mechanism, right? What seems to me particularly interesting about the illicit indicators is that the mechanism is one of attention getting, right? It's one that what we're doing is a really big problem, and here's the inflated value of the drug trade, of human trafficking. That's one thing that's more distinct about illicit indicators, or that stigmatization is a real mechanism, right? So for instance, State Department, it's not just the ranking, it's the fact that they're rated on this third tier. And yes, you do not want to be part of that third tier, just as the way you don't want to be on the OECD blacklist as an uncooperative tax haven, as Jason Sharman has exposed, or whatever. So I guess my question to you is then, what's distinct about these mechanisms and the way in which these rankings and ratings are used in the illicit sector versus the licit sector? Maybe that gives us some leverage on Kevin's points too about mechanisms of action here. So I'll give you all 1 last minute each to put all these questions to rest, and then we'll call it a night.
Just very briefly, one perverse consequence of the illicit indicator side of things is that often policies are prioritized that will generate the most visible and most easily quantifiable results,
Right.
and you'll downplay or underfund initiatives that are maybe incredibly important but just don't generate numbers.
Right.
So, case of Mexico or other Latin American countries with plagued by drug violence and the drug trade, judicial reform. In my view, absolutely the most important thing that's needed in Mexico. A lot of things are needed in Mexico right now, but judicial reform, very hard to actually measure that compared to how many traffickers they've arrested, how many hectares they've eradicated, and how many seizures they've done. So that has chronically been underfunded, and it's just an example of kind of a perverse consequence of you just don't put a lot of emphasis on things you can't measure. I would just say one more thing about that. It's also a reason why preventive action in general, in a lot of realms, including peacekeeping, whatnot, you're not going to go into a place to maintain and have a lot of political support to maintain the peace, because typically you send peacekeepers in reaction to something, but you can't quantify the value of, say, preventive action. Say, for example, in Bosnia, if the UN had sent large numbers of peacekeepers anticipating the conflict, which they easily could have, frankly, it would be hard to, note the non-event, right? The non-war. How do you get credit? In fact, you get a lot more credit for ending a war than for actually preventing something that you don't even know was going to happen.
Yeah, thanks.
Basically, I feel like we've gotten a lot of really wise words from people who know much more about statistics than I do. And so I just wanted to end on a note from somebody from my other world, Jaron Lanier, who wrote this book, You Are Not a Gadget, which I highly recommend to anybody anxious about the world. Basically, he says, information systems need to have information in order to run, but information underrepresents reality. And I think that is at the heart of where the majority of my concerns are.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for your great questions. Thank you to the panelists.